This podcast may contain explicit language. Welcome to the Greatest Movie of All Time podcast, the show that uses a unique grading style to redefine what the greatest movies are. I'm Tom Duncan.
And I'm Dana Duncan.
Tonight we apply our patent-pending Stanley rubric to Live and Let Die, starring Roger Moore, Jane Seymour, and Yaphet Kotto. However, quickly before we get to the show, you can still sign up for our weekly newsletter either by the website in the show notes, you can subscribe at the bottom of every page, or you can also email us at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. And, as always, please like, follow, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you use. With that, let's get into the movie, Live and Let Die. Dad, where does Roger Moore fall in your rankings of James Bonds?
Third. First is Connery, second is Craig, third is Moore. And it's said with some level of trepidation simply because Roger Moore was the Bond that I grew up watching and going to the theaters to see. Most of his later or the last 3 or 4 films I saw at the movie theater. So he's the Bond that I was the most familiar with. I went back and obviously watched Connery on television later on, or caught the earlier Bond films when they were on network TV when I was young. So
where do you think he ranks on my list?
4th, 5th.
Okay, there are currently 6 Bonds until after this No Time to Die comes out and we get the back end of whatever that's going to be. I'm sure they have somebody already in mind, but we're not going to get a casting decision until such time as they can put out this last movie because they don't want to undercut it. Number 1 is Sean Connery because I feel almost obligated to put him in there since he basically created the character. He has the most of the best, I guess, classic Bond movies. 2 for me is Daniel Craig. He's probably my favorite Bond. I love returning to all of his movies, even though some of them aren't as good as others. I think for the most part, people have said Casino Royale and Skyfall are transcendent. Quantum of Solace and Spectre are kind of below the mark. I can kind of agree with that, but I just like the way he's done the character. I like his grit. I like his vulnerability, and there's just something about him that has stuck with me since I saw his original Casino Royale in 2006, which coincidentally will be the next movie that we're covering. But he's number 2, just because I again, feel somewhat obligated to put Connery 1.
You have to be careful when you're criticizing Daniel Craig because you don't want your knives out.
Wah, wah. Thanks for that one. Dad jokes galore tonight. Anyway, number 3, George Lazenby. I think he's probably the closest to doing the original Connery without being derivative. He was by far the most confident, the most charismatic of some of the ones that followed. I have no problem with the way Dalton or Brosnan played the character comparatively. It's just different than Connery. He's about the closest that you got, and it made sense for where the jumping off point was going to be. It's kind of unfortunate that he only did one, both by his decision and somewhat of the studio's. So I get it, but I actually think that movie is often very overlooked for the Bond franchise. Number 4 is Pierce Brosnan on my list. I can appreciate what he does. I think he brings kind of a bridged gap between the Connery era that everybody compares back to and what we get with the Daniel Craig version. But unfortunately, it's kind of a mishmash of both and never really fully works, save for GoldenEye, in my opinion. Number 5, Timothy Dalton.
Wow.
Yes, folks. Unpopular opinion, Roger Moore is actually my least favorite Bond.
Wow. Okay.
It's because every Roger Moore movie, the more I watch it, reminds me of the 60s TV show of Batman. Everything is over campy. It's so leaning into the comedic aspect and the ridiculous part, kind of the way that Moore is described as self-deprecating, it is the way that those movies tended to be about Bond. They became so ridiculous and over the top that you could just easily lampoon them. They became a caricature instead of what the character was meant to be when Connery was playing it, which is why I have more of a appreciation for Craig or for Connery that treats it more of an action hero as opposed to a campy comedic action star in the vein of like if Luke Wilson, or excuse me, yeah, well, Luke or Owen Wilson were to play James Bond.
Oh my, I'm not sure how that would go.
Anyway, poor impressions aside, what is your relationship to the movie then?
It's difficult to remember back when I was just a kid, but like I've said many times, back in the 70s and into the late 70s, all the networks had like the movie of the week. And that's how you got to see certain movies that, had been out before. And I'm sure that's where I saw this because there wasn't a catalog from which to draw from a la Netflix. You didn't have DVDs or even VHS by which you could buy the film and watch it when you want. You were at the mercy of whenever the network was able to negotiate a deal to put it on. I know that I watched Goldfinger that way with my dad. I believe, searching through my memory, I did the same with this film, probably about 76, 77.
So I've referenced it twice. That first time that I saw James Bond, I got 4 movies from the Forest Lake, Minnesota Public Library. And they were Live and Let Die, Dr. No, Goldfinger, and Diamonds Are Forever. So this was part of that original 4, but it was the one that wasn't Connery, and it was just very different as to the tone and the character styling and everything else. And I think they intentionally wanted to be because they wanted to move it forward. I'm going to get to that later when we get into the scoring because I think that does affect things. But as for right now, what it's worth, it was one of the ones that I saw earlier on. For Roger Moore movies, this is the one I probably turn to the most often with the most comfort. Once you get to about Moonraker, they really start to break down. Like, The Spy Who Loved Me, I can get through just fine. I think it's an okay movie. The Man with the Golden Gun, I can even appreciate, even though it's kind of a lesser film in a lot of people's eyes. This one is still pretty high up, but it's the closest to what I still appreciate about the Bond character and being more of an action hero type, as opposed to the comedic one as he aged. Again, Roger Moore is the oldest person to start playing Bond. He did it when he was 45, as opposed to like Lazenby, who was 23. And I think Brosnan, Dalton, and Craig all did it either in their late 20s or early 30s. So by the time we get to something like Moonraker in the late 70s, you're getting a 50 to mid 50s Roger Moore trying to do all of these action hero stunts that he's not capable of doing. So it just becomes even more over the top, and he just looks too old to even be playing the part in some really crappy suits, if you ask my habit. But that's just because I hate the way a double breasted suit looks.
Well,
I digress.
yeah, the last couple of films, which were View to a Kill and Octopussy, were not good.
No. Even For Your Eyes Only is not great.
The best part of that film was Sheena Easton, but okay.
She's not even in the film.
I know, but the video was really good.
Yes, we can tell you were 17 at the time.
Oh yeah.
The point being that my relationship to this one extends back, but again, if I have to pick a Roger Moore movie, this is probably the best of them as far as I'm concerned. It has the most memorable stuff for me and the one I return to most often. So, is this the greatest Bond theme song? Now, I say that with the caveat being that the Dr. No theme song, as we discussed last week, I don't think I count that as a theme song to a specific movie. It's just the James Bond theme, since I wouldn't count like Gonna Fly Now as being the Rocky theme song to Rocky 1, but rather just the Rocky theme. I think that has more legs over the course of the franchise as opposed to being the Doctor No theme song, because it's not tied in, where almost every other theme song has to do with the movie.
I would have to say yes because I've actually seen McCartney play this live at Lambeau Field a couple of years ago. It is a great song, a great presentation. It's by a living legend in McCartney playing it. There's just so much about the song itself that's just iconic that yes, I think this probably is.
So my top five, as I can think of them now, View to a Kill by Duran Duran is not in the top five. Let's just start there. Number
Well, that was
five.
by far the best Duran Duran song ever.
Number five, Diamonds Are Forever. Number four, Nobody Does It Better.
Carly Simon.
Yes, I actually really love that song. Three, Live and Let Die. Two, Skyfall. Number one, Goldfinger.
Goldfinger's 2 for me. Skyfall's 3.
Skyfall was like, I want to say it charted in the top 10 at some point, and Live and Let Die has been remade multiple times. It's a huge mega single, probably the biggest single of Wings' career,
Yes.
or at least McCartney post Beatles. And Nobody Does It Better, I want to say, hit number one at one point.
I have a problem with Nobody Does It Better simply because CBS Sports in the late 70s decided to do a tribute to Walter Payton by using that song, and being a Packer fan, it just brings bad connotations.
Fair enough. I'm not going to decry that. I just like it because it seems overly glowing about the person they're trying to deify almost. And I wish that the song was about me.
It was Carly Simon, and she was still at the time married to James Taylor.
So let's dig further into this then. Do you have a plot summary ready for the folks in the audience?
I do. Three MI6 agents are killed under mysterious circumstances within 24 hours in the United Nations in New York City, in New Orleans, and in the small fictional Caribbean nation of San Monique, while monitoring the operations of the island's dignitary, Dr. Kananga, played by Yaphet Kotto. James Bond, Roger Moore, Agent 007, is sent to investigate these mysterious deaths while dodging Mr. Big, a mob boss who runs a chain of restaurants throughout the United States. Solitaire, played by Jane Seymour, a beautiful tarot card reader who can see both the future and remote events in the present, and a group of eccentric henchmen are trying to prevent Bond from uncovering their sinister plot. Bond seduces Solitaire to gain information on Dr. Kananga, but in the process she loses her gift of sight, and they both soon find their lives in danger. Will Bond discover the relationship between Mr. Big and Kananga? Will he find out what they're up to? And will Bond save the day and Solitaire?
Stay tuned for next week. Same Bond time, same Bond channel. All right, thank you for that. Cast: Roger Moore as James Bond 007, Yaphet Kotto as, spoiler, Dr. Kananga and Mr. Big, Jane Seymour as Solitaire, Clifton James as Sheriff J.W. Peppa, Julius W. Harris as Teehee Johnson, Jeffrey Holder as Baron Samedi, David Hedison as Felix Leiter, and Gloria Hendry as Rosie Carver. Recognition for this movie was nominated for Best Original Song for Paul and Linda McCartney for Live and Let Die, nominated for the Grammy for Best Song Written for a Motion Picture, and in 2004, the American Film Institute nominated the song Live and Let Die for AFI's 100 Years, 100 Songs. Did you know? Sean Connery turned down the then astronomical sum of $5.5 million, close to $32 million in 2019 dollars, to play James Bond for a seventh time. Connery gave Roger Moore his personal seal of approval for inheriting his role, calling him, quote, an ideal Bond. Did you know? The producers offered Clint Eastwood the role of James Bond, fresh from his success with Dirty Harry 1971. He was flattered, but declined, saying Bond should be portrayed by an English actor. Did you know? Roger Moore was 45 when he made his debut as 007, making him the oldest actor to portray the iconic character. The youngest was George Lazenby, who was 29 in On Her Majesty's Secret Service in 1969. Did you know? The producers made a conscious decision to make Roger Moore's Bond significantly different from Sean Connery's. In this film, Bond never orders a vodka martini, but drinks bourbon whiskey neat, no ice, instead. The mission briefing occurs in his flat, not the office, only the second time Bond's apartment is featured in the movies after an appearance in Dr. No, and Bond does not wear a hat. He smokes cigars instead of cigarettes. Did you know? Screenwriter Tom Mankiewicz dabbled with tarot cards to familiarize himself with the art. He took them to a party and performed tarot readings on the guests. At that party, Michael Caine and his then girlfriend attended, and he used his tarot cards to predict the two would be married. The two married, and Mankiewicz said in his autobiography that for years afterwards, Michael's wife, Shakira Caine, was convinced he had special powers. Did you know? It took crocodile wrangler and stuntman Ross Kananga, the villain in the movie was named after him, 6 takes to complete the scene where he doubles for Roger Moore when Bond flees the bad guys by running across the backs of 3 crocodiles in a swamp. Kananga received $60,000 for the stunt, filmed at Swamp Safaris, his 350 acres of mangrove swamp on Jamaica's north coast, where he kept a herd of over 1,000 crocodiles. In a 1973 interview, he explained, quote, "Something like that is almost impossible to do, so I had to do it 6 times before I got it right. I fell 5 times. The film company kept sending to London for more clothes. The crocs were chewing off everything when I hit the water, including shoes. I received 193 stitches on my leg and face." End quote.
Wow.
Did you know? Roger Moore suffered an injury during the boat chase. The engine cut out and the momentum carried him into a boathouse. He cracked some of his front teeth and twisted his knee. He had to walk on a cane for several days afterward, but was still able to complete the scene because all he had to do was sit in the boat. Did you know? The boat chase through the bayous was originally written in the script as just Scene 156, the most terrific boat chase you've ever seen. Bond's speedboat jump made it into the Guinness Book of World Records for its distance of 110 feet, 33.5 meters, a record that stood for 3 years. Clifton James's spontaneous reaction in that scene was kept in the final print. Bond's stunt boat used to make the high jump over Sheriff Pepper's car was specially designed with redistributed weight so that it would fly through the air with more stability. The second boat was not scripted to collide with the police car, but after this happened while shooting the stunt, the script was changed to accommodate it. Did you know? Roger Moore had a fear of snakes, just like his co-star Geoffrey Holder, who had to fall into a coffin full of them. As a result, they hated shooting that scene. In addition, the script supervisor was so afraid she refused to be on set with them. An actor fainted while filming a scene where he's killed by a snake, and Jane Seymour became terrified as a reptile got closer. Did you know? According to Yaphet Kotto, he was not allowed to do any press for this movie, nor was he allowed to attend the premiere. Kotto states the producers told him that they were afraid of the public's reaction to the villain being black. Did you know? The first Bond film in which 007 has a liaison with a black woman, Rosie Carver, played by Gloria Hendry. When this movie was released in South Africa, all of Hendry's love scenes were removed due to the apartheid policies of the government at the time. Did you know? Tom Mankiewicz originally wrote the main Bond girl to be black with an eye on Diana Ross for the part, but one of the producers told him it couldn't be done on account of some of their markets, primarily Japan and South Africa, banning all movies with interracial romances. It was until Die Another Day in 2002 featured the lead Bond girl as an African American again. Did you know? Roger Moore wrote a production diary during filming which was simply titled Roger Moore as James Bond 007 Live and Let Die 1973. It was published as a paperback by Pan in 1973 and features a complete dossier of filming from the first to last day. Accompanying it are several pages of color stills, many taken by Moore's then wife Louisa Mattioli. The book was never reissued and is today quite rare. In the book, Moore uses the same self-deprecating humor for which he became famous and details numerous otherwise unknown incidents, squabbles, milestones, and production notes. It was re-released in June 2018. So, with that, what is this movie about, Pop?
Secret agent on the trail of a corrupt Banana Republic leader.
Yeah, I've got pretty much the same thing. First successful recasting of a primary franchise character, British secret agent foils drug smuggling while dodging peril from Caribbean dignitary and a black gangster. You don't need to overcomplicate most Bond film plots until maybe the Daniel Craig movies.
Yeah.
They're pretty well self explanatory. But who is the best performance for you?
Roger Moore. I thought Roger Moore did a nice job of holding the film together. He was a key factor in the whole thing. He was believable as Bond. It was his first attempt at being Bond, so there's the old adage of having to replace the Hall of Famer. And with him, he had to endure, I'm sure, a lot of comparisons between himself and Sean Connery and whether or not he was going to be able to handle the role. I think he did well and confirmed himself in the role for a while at least.
I think commercially that would be the case. I think most people bought into him more than they bought into Lazenby, just based on the commercial backing alone. I don't know if I agree though that he made the best choice for Bond due to there's just an essence or a charisma that I don't find with him that I did with Connery. Again, it's an intangible quality, but I just never really have felt like he had it.
Well, Roger Moore was originally thought of play Bond in '62, but at the time he was committed to doing the television show The Saint, and he couldn't get out of his contract.
The same thing basically happened with Timothy Dalton and Pierce Brosnan when it came to Remington Steele. So I actually had Yaphet Kotto. We have memorialized him earlier this year. He passed away, and he was an affable mention in our Alien review. But I just, for all of the campy villains, and yes, this one kind of is unusual. I think he actually was more sinister than most people, especially contemporarily, gave him credit for. He has a good way of seeming confident and above everything else, but also forceful and sinister. There are a couple of moments that are really tense with him as the villain that you don't get from some of the other villains that we've had in some of the series. Notably, I don't get that moment of tenseness you have during the watch scene that I get from either the megalomaniacs in Moonraker or The Spy Who Loved Me. There's just not the same tenacity or fear that I have of what's going to potentially happen to Bond because everything that they do is even more fantastic. I think he had a good blend between being likable as the villain and affable, and also being harsh enough that you could, or it evoked a certain distaste for him. And so I thought he did a good job of blending in the two in arguably what would be one of the more tough villain castings that we've ever had.
What did you have for best secondary performance?
So this is maybe a bit unusual. I went Paul and Linda McCartney. I think more than anything, if there's something that's remembered about this movie, it's the theme song. I don't think if you ask, unless it's a Bond fan like you or I, or somebody from the UK, where I think this movie has a lot of traction yet, that if you mentioned the name Live and Let Die, that they would immediately think of the song, not the movie. And when it becomes that, just for the song composition and the rest of it, and I've maintained that minimally Paul McCartney is a top three songwriter of all time. So you put this in among his other lexicon. It's unfortunate that for the most part, this is his only non-Beatles work that is really transcended. But I think the song by itself is iconic. I mean, when I hung up the phone with you today when we were going to try and figure out what time we were recording, ironically, I had on the Beatles channel, and what should immediately pop up but Live and Let Die. So it's a perfect marriage of timing and things being exactly set. But I again, for their work and how it has represented or carried the name of the movie forward, I think they needed to be recognized.
Okay. My best secondary performance was Yaphet Kotto. And I, unlike you, like Roger Moore, uh, so I had to
I don't
rate it
have
based on
anything
that.
particularly against Roger Moore. I don't think I agree with either his choices or there again is an affable quality to playing Bond. I just don't think he ever had the it factor. Now, to be fair, I will watch more of Roger Moore's films than I will several of the last Pierce Brosnan films or any either of the Timothy Dalton films. I don't really care to watch Die Another Day and their weird changing a North Korean villain into some weird blonde British guy with this like weird plastic transformation thing that
Uh,
still doesn't make any sense to me, or where you turn me off so fast because License to Kill brings back Felix Leiter only for in the first 10 minutes to have him brutally murdered. Like, no, I'm out. What the fuck is this shit? So I will gladly watch The Spy Who Loved Me or The Man with the Golden Gun above either of those movies. But of the people that I think played the character to what I think of the character as, he's the last one on that list.
well, you're pointing out part of the problem, which is that the last A View to a Kill was the last film that was based upon an original Ian Fleming novel. Octopussy was based upon a short story.
And View to a Kill was completely original. It was not based on anything from Ian Fleming.
Oh,
Not to mention that 1987's Living Daylights is from the same Octopussy short story book.
oh, okay.
Like the official books ran out with For Your Eyes Only, with the exception being that Casino Royale, even though it does not adapt the book directly, and there, like, if you go back and read the original Casino Royale book that started everything, it's completely different than either of the movies. The one with David Niven from the 50s, or the one with, or I guess maybe it was the early 60s, I
It was
forget,
the early 60s.
or the one from 2006 with Daniel Craig. Even just from where the villain is and what they're trying to do, they're both very, very different. But most of, like, even Live and Let Die only loosely used the book. Like, a lot of these parts are written differently than how it was adapted in the book.
All right. Most charismatic?
So that one I had down Jane Seymour. Like, I've had a thing
Ding,
for
ding,
Jane
ding, ding,
Seymour,
ding.
and it's only because of this movie. Like, especially with how young she looks in this. But I don't know. This version of Jane Seymour as the young seductress has always appealed to me, and I thought she's actually been one of the sexier Bond girls ever. Personally, I would probably put her up there for me with Dr. Christmas Jones, Tatiana Romanova from Russia with Love, and boy, Eva Green's Vesper Lind from Casino Royale. Those all have to be pretty close to the top. I also Domino from Thunderball is up there on my personal list, but Jane Seymour's in that top five somewhere.
Okay. I had her as well. And she really kind of hit her stride about the time I was in my adolescence. So, enough said. Uh,
Okay, Dad.
but she had a longer career as she started to age and was not getting movie roles because movies in Hollywood in the 70s and 80s were female actresses had to be young, so they ended up on television for the most part. And so Jane Seymour did what was the name, Medicine Woman,
Oh, Dr.
Doctor,
Quinn, Medicine Woman.
yeah, and did that for I don't know 7 8 years I think. Not a show I watched because I think at the time I was spending most of my time in a library. And when I did watch TV, I was more interested in laughing.
To be fair, she is. I would put her up there with like the Helen Mirrens of the world as someone who has aged wonderfully.
Oh, yes. She still does TV where she designs jewelry for, I can't remember which
I
jewelry
think it's K
company.
Jewelers,
Yeah.
but yeah, she's still a very attractive woman.
Oh, yeah. As Tony Kornheiser from or ESPN always says, she's getting it done.
Thank you for being the creepy old man.
I'm just quoting Tony.
Yeah, that's not helping your case. Anyway, let's get to best scene. The first one I had down was the New Orleans funeral. I did not anticipate that. And to a certain degree, I still don't anticipate it every time it happens. I know exactly what's going to happen, but the way that that scene plays out, I actually think it's one of the more clever versions of a assassination, especially early on in these movies where like three or four agents eventually have to die in one of these set pieces. And to have that whole production of the funeral and have it staged and, whose funeral is it? Yours. And I don't know. I just like the interplay of that scene and how it all kind of unfurls. And then they do it a second time, and I think it works just as well the second time, even though a bunch of the clips are pretty much the same. I'm pretty sure they basically just reused certain clips, but
Sure. I had the Roosevelt Highway where the villain comes up and ends up shooting the Bond's driver in the head. If you've been to New York, that road they're on is infamous. The road they're on is infamous. It's Roosevelt Highway, Roosevelt Road, something like that. It runs along the harbor. I don't know how they managed to have that closed so they could film there. My guess is that it had to be like really early in the morning or something. But I thought that was a well done scene and enjoyed the way it was performed.
yeah, but you could also start to see some of the elements of the campiness start to come out in that with the tracking down of the white pimpmobile.
Okay.
It was just a little bit too much for me, but likewise, I had the next scene basically from that. So Bond going to Harlem. If there's a area to poke fun at, it's the quintessential white man's folk hero going into the epitome of blackness and how much that would stick out. I don't know if they did a really great job in playing up the difference or the highlight in race, and I don't know if people my age, the Zoomers or anything else like that, can really appreciate a white person going into certain black neighborhoods. But yeah, I think there is something there, and him sticking out like a cue ball, I think was the term used. I just like the interplay of all of that, and then him ending up in the voodoo shop or the rest of it. It works well as a set piece.
Well, and I think your generation and the generation behind you is going to have a hard time understanding that because Harlem has changed significantly. That's the one thing. The neighborhoods and the boroughs within New York City have altered, and Harlem is really modified. It's much more upscale. And after all, that's where Bill Clinton's office is, and where I think he has a house or a condominium is in Harlem. So it's changed a lot. So I think there's going to be a certain element that's going to be a problem. Now, as far as being white and being in a black neighborhood, I can relate a little bit because I came from a city that was about a third African American.
What's your next scene then?
I have Rosie in the hotel room. And the
Okay,
whole,
I had the little bit after that with them kind of out on the Kananga Island or Cove or whatever they're doing.
yes.
But why the hotel room?
I don't know, there was kind of a comic interplay. The whole thing with Rosie. Well, Felix told me, and I just thought that it gave me a little bit of a chuckle that his reputation preceded him.
Yeah, certainly I can get that. I nominated after it because I do think that it's the first time that we really think of, with the exception where we know ahead of time in Thunderball that one of the women that Bond sleeps with could be the enemy. But this is probably the first time where you get a flip like that, where the person that he's with, that he's supposed to be working with, is actually working for the enemy. And so, just from the significance of how that ends up playing out in a lot of action movies, a lot of spy movies, and the franchise going forward, because I think it's happened a number of times. Famously, in The World Is Not Enough with the Electric King character, I think this would be the first time that I can remember that that flip happened, and it's kind of a significant moment in the movie. So the next one that I had down then, past confronting Rosie, was, and realistically, for the next 4 out of the 5 scenes that I have, it's all set pieces. For 3 of those are chases, and one is just another action sequence. I mean, this movie has so many frickin' chases in it. So let's just go with this one, the bus chase, which
Yes.
is probably the least of the chases, but they're really overloading the amount of chase sequences that are in this movie. And they work out fine in this one. But at a certain point, I started looking through all of these, and I'm like, all right, so there's a bus chase, there's an airplane chase that I have to nominate, and there's a boat chase.
Yes.
And they're all good. They're all staged well. The boat chase is probably the best out of any of them because it has the most longitude to work with, and they're the most just regular stunts. Although, personally, I think the airplane one is kind of unnecessary and probably could have been cut because it tends to be more comedic and almost feels Benny Hill like in its staging. But
Have you ever
I'll go with the
watched
bus
Benny
chase.
Hill?
Briefly, bits and pieces. I've seen bits and pieces to know the yakety yak, and that's what that felt like.
Okay.
What's your next one then?
I had the crocodiles and the crocodile farm.
So that was one of the only other ones that I had, but why for you?
I just liked the whole thing. And when in the did you know section, I was shocked. I thought for sure they were using, some sort of models to run across.
There are videos on YouTube that I've seen before. They filmed the whole takes. You can watch them testing that. They're uploaded on there, and they're using the real Crocs. And I don't know how they got them in position or how that worked out, but yeah, it's kind of fantastic to watch that. So if you get some extra time, you can find them on YouTube.
Yeah, I would be curious to know what $60,000 would be in today's dollars.
It would be roughly equivalent to about 363,777 and 3 cents dollars.
Boy, to be running across crocodiles and have 120 some stitches.
193
193? Yeah, I think he was underpaid.
for his leg and face.
Yes.
Yeah, I think he was grossly underpaid. And this would go in the category of support for however many people thought that the stuntmen needed a category at the Oscars.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, I think I nominated this as my most iconic and favorite scene. It's the one that sticks out to me the most because it's probably the most unusual and practical escape of any of the Bond situations. If you go through all of the Roger Moore films for all of the ways that he tried to escape something, this just seems like somewhat pure dumb luck and seizing on an opportunity. Like his magnetic watch couldn't help him out of the situation because it's always some gadget that helps him escape or avoid death or whatever it is. Like even at the ending when they're in the lair and they're going through, I guess, what ends up being the final showdown with Kananga, he uses his watch as a, I don't know, saw to cut through the ropes.
Yes.
It's over the top, but this one has such an elegant solution running across the Crocs, and I really don't know how they filmed it. But as far as one of the most famous stunts, just on a practical level, I put it up there in most of the Bond history as one of the better ones.
Any other scenes?
The only other one is one I've kind of made passing reference to, and I just really like the way that they draw out and intensify the watch scene, especially with how it's staged, because you think like Bond gets away with it and she's done it accurately, and you come to find out that she doesn't, and like he ends up violently beating her, which isn't a good look and is kind of in my classicness score, but is authentic to the movie. You really get the full fledged character of Kotto's Dr. Kananga by that point. And I like the way that that scene plays out from, snap Mr. Bond's little finger and then go to the more vital areas to all of those little things. I think it's actually one of the better scenes in the movie.
Well, I have one more that I'd like to nominate. and that is the train scene. Just the sheer fact of the guy with the mechanical arm and all the things associated with that, and how and the wrestling, the fight within the compartment, the fact that Jane Seymour is locked into the berth, doesn't know what's going on. I like that scene. I think it's kind of fun. It kind of was a good way to end the film.
I would nominate it, but there seems to be one of these at the end of every single Bond film. And this is also extremely reminiscent of the fight with Robert Shaw from Russia with Love.
Oh, okay.
So, not that I'm picking on it. Like, I understand where you're going with that. It's just, I have too much history with Bond as a whole. So, then I already told you what my favorite and my most indelible were. What were yours?
The boat chase. When I watched this as a kid, that's the one thing I remembered more than anything was the boat chase.
So, that's most indelible and favorite?
Yes. I just think the boat chase and the whole thing of what was going on, right down to the fact that, you have the old southern gentry sitting around the pool, and all of a sudden a boat flies into their pool. And they're like, they barely bat an eye.
Wow, but it also introduces us to a recurring over the top character in J.W. Pepper, one of the worst Bond characters ever. And yet, we still also get the magic of a Roger Moore film like, oh, go get Billy Bob. He's got the fastest boat on the bayou. Oh,
Yes.
you gotta catch him, Billy Bob. Why do we need that? Why do we need that added? Why does it have to be repeated 7 times? A secret agent?
Well, do you want my opinion as a
Yes.
movie critic, or do you want my opinion as a cynical lawyer?
I don't care. I want your opinion. That's what the whole point of a
I'm
podcast
going to
is.
give you the opinion as a cynical lawyer. Bond just slept with a black woman. So if you don't put some racist caricature of a southern sheriff in the film, you're not selling this film in 1973 in Alabama, in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in North Florida, in Georgia.
I suppose.
Well, that's just the cynical lawyer in me who sees what really takes place and how producers think of things and do things, the calculated
Then why do we need to
process
bring him
they
back for the man on
imply.
the golden gun while he's having vacation in Thailand?
You mean Thailand?
Yes. Oh, we need to take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. As this is a pre-taped episode that we're doing a couple of months in advance, we do not know whether we need to recognize anybody that's passed. We will let you know when we get back from our vacation. So with that, let's just move right into best funniest lines. And I'll say this: some of the lines really have not aged well as far as the quippiness of a Bond movie.
Okay. Yeah. There's a lot from the 1970s that did not age well. Leisure Suits, Disco.
What's your first nominee?
What happened to Kananga? I think he had a rather inflated opinion of himself.
Okay, can I just pause for a second? This should be an unanswerable question, but why do you need to ask what happened to Kananga? You're not pinned down anywhere. You're not locked away. You're not in a soundproof room. You just saw him explode on the ceiling. Why do you need to ask other than to set up that line?
Well, of course.
Oh, God, that was just.
Well, maybe she was just being a damsel in distress and was shuddering her eyes from the horror that might be.
All right, this is going to be a nominee, and it is going to come back in my review. This is not a best of anything. It's not a funniest of anything, but it is notable, so I'm putting it here. Rosie, you don't understand, see? They'll kill me if I do. and I'll kill you if you don't. But you couldn't. You wouldn't. Not after what we've just done. I certainly wouldn't have killed you before. How disposable are women to Bond? I mean, it's more evident than ever right there.
Yeah.
That is the number one thing. Like, it's implied in the Connery films. This straight up says it.
Yeah.
What's your next one up?
Tee. There are two ways to disable a crock. James Bond. I don't suppose you'd care to tell me what they are. Tee. One way is to take a pencil and stick it in the pressure area above its eye. Bond. And the other way? Tee. Oh, the other way is twice as simple. You just stick your hand in his mouth and pull out his teeth.
Yeah, I had that one too. I think it's probably one of the better ones. And the only other one I had was Bond has just explained the first two lovers' lessons to Solitaire. Solitaire. Is there time before we leave for lesson number 3? Bond, undressing. Of course. There's no sense going out half-cocked.
Yes.
All right. Did you have any others?
With a level of mercy, no. This is not one of the more well written Bond films.
No. It's more believable and realistic than some of the plots of the other ones, but
Yes. But the screenwriters should almost not take credits.
all right. So then let's move into the Stanley rubric. I'll let you take Legacy first. I have a little bit more grandiose opinion that I'd like to hold on to for a second.
All right. Dividing it into two, I went with 4 for Legacy simply because it established that somebody other than Sean Connery could play James Bond. And so I gave it a 4 for that reason. 3.5 simply because I don't think many of the Bond films of Roger Moore have aged overly well, and they're not in the category of what a lot of people believe to be quality or something, that's on the Mount Rushmore of Bond. So I
So,
went with 7.3 total. Or, excuse me, I went with 7.5 total.
oh,
So 4 for industry and such, and 3.5 for the public, more or less.
okay, because I had written down a 4 for you originally. So, based on your characteristics, I wouldn't have put it that high. To me, it was a bit of a struggle to get to the final score that I did, but that's with the caveat that I think this is a unintended significant movie. So, commercially, On Her Majesty's Secret Service was more or less a flop for the franchise. This ended up making a buttload of money. In today's dollars, it would be just under $1 billion, making it one of the most commercially successful Bond films of all time. It is still a celebrated, and I think it's still the most watched cable movie ever in the UK. So the audience score for this is a little bit higher, not great, but not terrible. I kind of gave it a 2, and it's basically because outside of the UK, I do agree with you. This is kind of a forgotten movie unless you grew up in that era. I think that people growing up with Roger Moore as Bond, this would be closer to the top of the Roger Moore list, but you might get something like The Spy Who Loved Me, I think is most often associated with the pinnacle of the Roger Moore Bond era. I think that, in fact, is my favorite director's, Christopher Nolan's favorite Bond movie. With that being said, the industry half of this is unintentionally aided. And this is an oddly significant movie in one particular way that I think you've kind of slowly glossed over in your scoring, even though my score will end up being slightly lower than yours. And I ended up giving the industry a full 5 because this is a pretty significant movie for them to have the first real recast of a lead role in a franchise, thus making the franchise bigger than the star itself. I know it wasn't the first time Bond had been played by somebody other than Connery. Again, we'll look back at Lazenby and On Her Majesty's Secret Service. But this is proof of concept that eventually gave people the permission structure to recast Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, leads in Star Wars, for that matter, and what we will eventually get in a move away from Harrison Ford, which they probably should have already done, for Indiana Jones.
Oh,
The
please.
concept of what?
I said, oh, please. He's just a crotchety old fart now.
Well, I think in order to move the franchise forward, they really need to do something else, but apparently he's doing Indiana Jones 5 now. Regardless,
Indiana Jones and the seeking of the Social Security check.
I think we've had four very distinct marketable eras of Hollywood. You had the silent era, you had the studio system, you had the movie star system, where all you had to do to bank a particular picture was get a movie star, put them out in something, and then they would sell. And now we've gone to franchises. And while this is a long time ago and a precursor to what ended up being the franchise era, because again, we covered Iron Man, which I think is pretty close to around the time, so mid 2000s, late 2000s, when franchises started becoming the major tentpoles for studios. But you can do away with Iron Man in the last Avengers movie or Captain America and move the franchise forward because the franchise is bigger than one particular star or actor or the character who personifies something. You can reboot Batman 3 times or Spider-Man 3 times or Superman 3 times and still move the ball forward to stuff that people will watch because they'll buy somebody new in it as long as you have a different or fresh take on the character. And I think that the importance of this movie is you could do that. It gave them a permissible structure by which to point at something and say, yeah, it's possible. So I gave it a full 5 from that. I gave it a 2 for the audience for a total of 7. So between your 7.5 and my 7, that's a 7.25 average. Impact significance. I think this, oddly enough, has less of a significance when you take out the big legacy factor for the industry, because I think that had more unintended consequences. The impact ends up being more centered on, I guess, the uh, popularity of the movie. Again, this is still a hugely popular movie in the UK, and it made just under the equivalent of $1 billion at the box office. Like, that's not something to write off. For being the first Roger Moore film, that's pretty highly successful, and given some of the chances that they were making with race relations in this movie, I'm kind of surprised it did as well as it did. So my audience score ended up being a 4. The industry side of it, though, like, the critics pretty much deadpanned this and still deadpan it. Like, there are contemporary reviews at the time calling this kind of cartoonish and that they didn't really like the campiness because again, there's a tonal shift towards a much more self-deprecating, humorous, lampooning style that was personified in the Roger Moore era that isn't there for any of the other Bond eras, where they're much more self-serious. So I ended up at a 6 overall.
Well, I had a much higher number, and having lived through this era and watched the film and know what impact it had on things. I mean, this was 1973. And having lived through that period of time, life kind of sucked. I mean, we had things that were going on. Watergate was starting to boil over. Things didn't seem like they should. We just ended up getting out of, or were in the process, or had gotten out of Vietnam. Things just kind of. So this film was an escape. And the critics, and normally we've been dividing this, I'm going to override that division. No one gave a fuck what the critics said. This was an escape. This is what a bunch of people did. A boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife. The man wanted to go and see this. The wife said, okay. The wife had enough entertainment by the chases and the relationships and all of this to enjoy it. And the man just wanted to get away. This is something completely outside of what life was. We're talking about New York City being almost bankrupt. We're talking about runaway inflation. We're talking all the things. This was an escape. So the impact and significance of this film coming out in 1973, I don't think you can minimize having not lived through that era. Now, I admit that maybe I'm overblowing it because I would have been in third grade, fourth grade at the time. So I'm talking about what, 8, 9, 10 years of age at the time. I would have been 9 going on 10. So maybe I have a false perception, but I think most 9 or 10 year olds are not as prescient about what's going on in the world as I was at that particular time. So if I'm picking up on it, I think there's a large aspect of society that's picking up on it. And so I think this film transformed Bond into something that was more than entertaining, but more to the point of being, I'm going to go see James Bond, so I've got 2 hours where I don't have to think about shit.
To be fair, it's possible I might be discounting it from the industry side in connection with the impact of a successful second Bond actor and what it would do to promote the franchise. Because you get, I think Roger Moore has the most films of any Bond, 6 of them, I believe, 7.
Yeah.
Live and Let Die, The Man with the Golden Gun, The Spy Who Loved Me, Moonraker, For Your Eyes Only, that's 5. Then, yeah, so Octopussy and A View to a Kill, that's 7, and one more than Connery. So to be able to have that long of a tail from this and to be somewhat successful, or at least commercially successful, I guess I can give it more credit than I had. I still, it would be bumping it up slightly on the industry, but it's again to promote the franchise. So maybe I just diminished it too much on that side. My audience score was high. It's just from an industry standpoint of the significance in it, I just don't find as much.
I think that we ended up about this time having a whole series of films that were just entertainment and escape. I mean, what was it? Was it 70, 73, 74? Was 74 was the Sting?
73.
70? Okay.
Because The Godfather was 72 and 74 was Godfather Part 2.
Okay. But again, we're talking about films where it's a different world, a different reality, where people are just wanting to not be in the current.
Well, for franchise and blockbusters or that type of movie and escapism, I think we've argued it on multiple occasions that the 70s is possibly the best decade of movies ever produced. And you start thinking, like, The Godfather was a huge commercial success and a blockbuster movie. Jaws, Star Wars. You're talking about multiple franchise movies. I think there's a lot to be said for that. I just don't know what this particular Bond movie has to say on the whole for adding into that category. You didn't give a score yet. What was
Well,
your
I haven't
final?
gotten to it. So I went with an 8.5 simply because this was a film that people flocked to because it just, you could watch it and you walked out and you felt better.
Well, it still then takes us to a average of 7.25, mirroring the one from Legacy, and I think that's probably a good spot as far as I'm concerned. I might be underweighting it, you might be overweighting it, but it'll balance out in the end.
Well, and you're wrong and I'm right because I lived through it.
Or maybe you're just too close to it.
Maybe, but not.
I suppose eye rolls don't really work for the podcast medium. Novelty. I had a 3. The only source of points where I would upgrade it as far as its novelty score would be on the role of black characters in a movie like this at the time, considering all of the restrictions. So George Wallace had his big presidential run in, what, 72, right? where he won a bunch of states, or was that 68?
68, 72. He was running and may have, but then he got shot by Bremer.
Okay. Either way, given the international situation that we kind of like to pass over at times, it's not like 73 was that far removed from a lot of the civil rights movement. And to have a black primary villain and all of his henchmen being black and most of the general characters and being in a lot of black locations, Caribbean islands, Harlem, New Orleans. It's certainly a different take on that for what I already maintain is, in some ways, the quintessential white male fantasy action hero. So I gave it points for that. I do think they undercut themselves a little bit, but I'll get to that here with classicness more. Still, while they did a tonal shift, you're still taking on the shell of what Connery and the previous Bond movies had established. So I don't know. It's not completely reinventing the wheel. You went a little bit ahead, but it's areas of gray more than anything. I ended up at a 3.
Well, I hope you were able to get out the calculator here and average this out, but I also had a 3.
Oh, that's gonna be tough.
Might have to get your math
That
skills
never
out.
happened to me before.
Yeah, and a lot of your reasoning is poignant for my thought process. I mean, this is Bond. How much novelty can you give to a franchise film when there's been 7 or 8 films already done? The novelty is that we're portraying it with primarily African Americans and an African American and Bond sex scene. And I, I guess that's the only reason I gave it more points than I would have normally done because it really isn't novel. So that's why I went with a 3. I'm not going to belabor the point because I think if you thought about it, it's not that novel. Other
Well,
than
and to be
those
fair, I thought it was
points.
somewhat of a liberal 3, even at that.
Yeah.
Like I can
Eh,
understand it, but they do undercut
eh.
themselves a little bit by not really putting Yaphet Kotto or the woman who played Rosie Carver out front to really promote the movie either. I understand why they did it, but if you're going to make the choices to include them in the beginning, like at least Kotto, it would have made sense to make him a little bit more central to the promotion.
You have to remember the history. About the time this film was released, we were still having issues about forced integration and busing. 2 members or 2 appointees of Reagan for the Supreme Court were denied because they were linked to being racists.
Do you mean
And
Nixon? Because Reagan didn't take over for another like 8 years.
did I say Reagan?
Yes.
I meant Nixon.
Okay.
Sorry.
Well, I just want to
Anyway,
make that correction because anybody who's got a history background will be wondering where you went there.
that's fine. I'm. It was Nixon. Anyway,
One of the
so
two really terrible Republican presidents. Anyway,
you're gonna limit it.
I was trying to. Okay, of the 20th century,
The last Republican president that I could find some value in was Eisenhower.
yeah, and before that, I could find value in some areas of Taft or Roosevelt. I didn't
Yes.
have too many issues. Well, okay, I got to lump in Harding too and Coolidge as bad Republicans. But anyway,
Although I must say that one of my favorite Republican presidents is Chester A. Arthur.
okay. Point being that let's move over to classicness. You're a little bit more nuanced on this. I'm curious to hear your take before I give mine. I kind of worked my way through it very casually and slowly to get to my number, but you may have some points I hadn't considered, so I'll let you go first.
All right. I'm going to give you the score and then tell you where I'm going with this. 6.5. I always go with a 5 and then go up or down based on it. So, the classicness aspect of it, interracial relationships, gave it big points up to me. But the fact that how it's portrayed, the fact that we have what's really kind of a local sheriff that's like one step above Lester Maddox. And for those of you who don't know, that was the former governor of Georgia who blocked black students from entering the University of Georgia back in the 60s. Anyway, and then at the same time, we are almost cavalier about the fact that this 40-year-old man takes the virginity of a 20-year-old girl. And it's like, well, that's the way it goes. Hey, I'm lucky I got you.
Yeah, I definitely had that as part of my review. I also brought in and kind of partnered it with the disposability of Rosie Carver. I know as working for
Yeah.
the enemy, it's supposed to make it excusable, but it really sets up and knocks down. It's like saying the private thing in public. When you give voice to that, it just doesn't resonate well or kick back well on you. And to really reveal, oh, well, yeah, we were gonna, or I'm gonna set you up now, and either I'm gonna kill you or they're gonna kill you. You have to make a choice, and I don't care whether or not we just had sex, because I wasn't gonna set you up before this because I wanted the nookie.
Yeah.
Not
Okay.
to mention, as you mentioned, the because I think Jane Seymour's playing somebody relatively young, like at worst, maybe in her early 20s,
Yes.
possibly with the way I haven't read the book, but if the character was written to be, in her late teens, I mean, it's even creepier because, as we mentioned, Roger Moore being the oldest to start playing Bond at 45, like there's a significant gap, and he not only takes her virginity, but tricks her into doing it. That's an extra added level. And just on those standpoints alone, it would age poorly from where I started at a 7 and go backwards. I'm not sure how you gained points from a 5 if you had all of those issues. Where this also loses points for me is in the campiness. I think it sets up a fairly poor era that opened up the door for, while I do appreciate and enjoy the Austin Power films, there's a part of me that like is a little bit sad that they have to exist because some of these Bond films are so ridiculous and over the top, but it almost all comes from the Moore era. Like every part of this, yes, he's lampooning Doctor Evil with the takeoff of Doctor No, and then it's modeled on Blofeld, and there are some parts at the end of the Connery films that are a little bit more fantastical, but none of them end up having your primary villain blow up like a Willy Wonka character and explode on the ceiling.
Well,
So I
and
ended up at a 3. I feel pretty
uh,
comfortable with where I sat, but I just don't think this, in retrospect, ages well, even though, again, I think this probably is the best of the Roger Moore era for me.
and the reason I gave it higher marks is because I don't think you realize in 1973 how absolutely revolutionary and if not shocking it was to have a mixed race relationship.
You're probably right.
And that's where I'm coming with the 6.5. So,
Because I think we're, what, 8 years removed from Loving?
yeah.
What I'm referring to there, folks, is the Loving v. Virginia case that even allowed interracial marriage. So we ended up at a 4.75 for classiness, and I think that's probably fair. It might be a little lower if I got my part of it wrong, but I'll be willing to stand on my side because I think at some point we can't put all the Bond films up quite high with how lampooned and admonished the character is for its womanizing, heavy drinking, and basically a lot of things that we at one time thought were great and have since aged out of. So the 80s were,
Oh, I'm not sure about that. I would honestly say that a large portion of the male population will not say publicly that they still envy that time frame and those issues, but I think in reality, I don't protect my gender. I think there's a large aspect of that population that still exists, and they do it clandestinely instead of openly.
Thanks much, Tucker Carlson. Anyway, moving on.
I don't have a bow tie.
All right, let's turn to rewatchability then. What do you have down?
I have a 7.5. To me, a film that I would normally rewatch if I had it available is a 5. 7.5 is something that I would watch and possibly watch if I saw it on. It would have to be more or be a higher score if it was something that I would go out of my way to rewatch. Just the fact that the Live and Let Die soundtrack plays for part of the film makes it rewatchable. Having Sir Paul play it live in front of me only enhances the value of it to me. So, 7.5.
There are several Bond films that I just simply have no time for. I've said on multiple occasions the Timothy Dalton ones. I think I've seen License to Kill, maybe the first half of it. I'm not sure I've even finished it, to be honest. I was just so turned off in the opening part of that movie that it's not even viewable for the most part. Living Daylights was okay. The back half of the Roger Moore era is just A View to a Kill, Octopussy, okay. I can get about as far as For Your Eyes Only, but it's a bit of a struggle even on those. And those are the last couple of books by Fleming that he got to do. If I'm going to watch any of the Bond films, it's probably Connery and then Craig. And then I might get one or two, like Tomorrow Never Dies and or Goldeneye from the Pierce Brosnan era are okay. I can't watch Die Another Day again because it's just so ridiculous. But the Craig era and then the original Connery era, those are like the peak ones for me. I could sit and watch an easy marathon of either one of those two back to back to back. But if there is a Roger Moore film that I can fit in and be comfortable with revisiting, it's probably this one. I'll give it an extra half point from what I thought I might, where I have a bit of a passing indifference to most of the Roger Moore Bond films, despite him being my number 5. So I'll give it a 6.5. The average between us will then end up being a 7.
We're able to do that. You didn't need the calculator.
You make the same joke all the goddamn time.
The joke is that I make the same joke
Yeah,
all the
except it's
goddamn
tired.
time.
Do you have Wisconsin? Anyway, our audience score for this one was an 86% on Google users, a very low 64% for Rotten Tomato users, ending up at a 7.5. And all told, added up 36.75, and that places it in between Dodgeball and Cool Hand Luke on the list.
All right.
So not terribly high, but it's not on the lows of The Quiet Man, Wedding Crashers, or The Greatest Show on Earth. It's going to be hard for anybody to get too much lower than The Greatest Show on Earth that's featured on this show. Unless it's like one of our April Fool's episodes. So, remaining questions. Why couldn't Kananga have spit out the cartridge after Bond stopped holding his mouth?
I don't know.
It just seems asinine to me that that's the way your villain dies, is he can't spit out a cartridge.
And, well, the question I had was, he blows up, but do you see any blood?
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any other questions?
What happened to Solitaire?
The same with every Bond girl after every Bond movie.
She eats a pint of Haagen-Dazs and recovers?
She's disposable.
Okay.
So, my final question then has to do more with the plot. Yes, you're introducing a bunch of free drugs onto the market to take heroin away. You're not completely cornering all of the drug markets. You're just cornering the heroin market. Now, mind you, it's probably about 30 to 40 years ahead of time. but how exactly are you going to drive all of the major gangsters out of the drug trade? Like, I think there's a problem with them trying to set themselves up as a monopoly. They're going to drive some of the low-level dealers out, but he's just going to be inviting huge gang wars. That's going to be the end of his plot. Like, it's one of the, while it's more realistic than several of the other plot lines that are in these, namely, I'm going to nuke the entire world so that everything lives under the sea, or I'm going to create a new world on the moon. Like, it's a little bit more believable than either of those, but still, in comparison, it's not a great plan.
All right.
So, do you have any final thoughts then for the week?
No.
All right. Well, this is my life. It always will be. There's nothing else, just us and the microphones and those wonderful people out there in the dark. All right, Mr. DeMille, I'm ready for my close-up. Please like, follow, rate, and review, or whatever on whichever platform you have so that you can join in on our fun. You can also email the show at greatestaltimemoviepodcast@gmail.com. Find us on Instagram at gmodepodcast, or find Dana or I on Twitter at TJ3Duncan or at Dana W. Duncan. The Greatest Movie of All Time is a production of Ronnie Duncan Studios. Our show is mixed, edited, and written by Thomas Duncan. Our music is thanks to Purple Planet Music. Our technical provider and distributor is Captivate FM.